Samuel 19:28. The words spoken say the following: Thy servants, my father's house, was but dead before my lord the king, but thou hast made me to eat among those that sit at the king's table. What right, therefore, have I to cry any more to the king? The statement conveyed was simply this: I have no right to cry. Hey, Hunter, I have no right to cry either, but would you care to hand me that PowerPoint controller right there that's on that front pew? Thank you. What right have I to cry? There you go. Now, those things being said, what right have I to cry? Let's leave that thought, understanding that the one that said it was named Mephibosheth. We'll return to it. For now, have you ever attended a birthday party of a young child? Gifts are being opened, presents given, and other children attending begin to start asking the question, what about me? What about me? And it doesn't take long before tears ensue. Maybe a hissy fit or a temper tantrum or whatever the technical term is. We understand it with children. They have to learn how to look at life and not just think about self. What about me? It's a bit more of a challenge when that behavior is coming from an adult. It's more problematic. There's a reason why Paul told Christians, Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than himself. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Paul encouraged the Philippians, who, by the way, were going through some difficult times, not just to think about themselves, but to think about one another. Selfishness will always lead to self-pity. Frequently, when people are absorbed in their own self-pity, it has resulted from a focus on self instead of a willingness to be concerned with others. Now, as Christians, it is an identifying characteristic that we help others. Galatians 6:2, bear ye one another's burdens, fulfill the law of Christ. Galatians 6:10, as ye have therefore opportunity, do good to all men, especially them of the household of faith. Yes, we are to be helping others. That's who we are. And yes, as Christians, there is an identifying aspect of our character when we indeed help ourselves. Galatians 6:5, every man shall bear his own burdens. We have a responsibility to help others, to help self. But one responsibility we don't have, and one thing that is not to be a characteristic of Christians, is the tendency to help ourselves to others and to other stuff. In fact, the exact opposite of that is enjoined upon Christians throughout the New Testament. 1 Thessalonians 3:10, if a man will not work, neither should he eat. Paul had to instruct the brethren in Thessalonica regarding those that were trying to abuse their brethren and make physical gain out of nothing. When he wrote to Timothy, he said, if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he's denied the faith and is worse than an infidel, 1 Timothy 5:8. There are those whose covetousness leads to the abuse of others, the misuse of others, the desire for what others have. How should we look at things? Well, the way it's described in Acts 4 and Acts 5. Acts 4:32, neither said any of them, those early Christians, that aught of the things that he possessed was his own, but they gave freely. It's not mine. It wasn't a matter of what's mine is mine. It was what's mine is yours. But then compare that with Acts 5:3 and 4, when Peter's speaking to Ananias about his lying contribution. But Peter makes the statement, Acts 5:4, while it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? Isn't that fascinating? Acts 4, what's mine is yours. That's how the Christian sees it. Acts 5, Ananias, what's yours is yours. It's your responsibility. There are those in this world that look at things, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. That's not the Christian mindset. Thus, Paul's words to the Colossians, When he said, mortify your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Covetousness, this desire for what others have. Now, we typically think of covetousness and we connect it to the desire for material, physical things. But let's take that thought, remembering that covetousness is idolatry, and bring it back to the one who said, what right have I to cry? Because his name is Mephibosheth. And his name literally means scatterer or shatterer of shame, dispeller of shame, or dispeller of idols. Here is a man whose name means to scatter or to shatter shame, to shatter idolatry. Covetousness is idolatry. And in viewing Mephibosheth's life, if there was one thing of which he can't be accused of being guilty, it's a covetousness. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The man's selflessness drips from every page where his name appears. Dispeller of shame, shatterer, scatterer of idols. The first introduction to Mephibosheth occurs 2 Samuel 4:4. We're told concerning Mephibosheth that he was, I think we've had a window pop up there. We're told concerning Mephibosheth that he was 5 years old. He's the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul. Jonathan, David's friend. Saul, the former king, whom David had served loyally, but who sought David's life. There we go. Mephibosheth was 5 years old when news came out of Jezreel concerning the death of Jonathan and Saul. That would refer to 1 Samuel 31. And he had a nurse that picked him up and that carried him. And as she made haste and fled, he fell and became lame in his feet. He's handicapped. He has been disabled since the age of 5, lame in his feet. From the first introduction to Mephibosheth, all that's demonstrated is loss. He lost his grandfather. He lost his father. He lost his mobility. And there's a sense in which he loses nobility. But we'll discuss that momentarily. Mephibosheth. We're introduced to him and all we see is loss. But the final words recorded from Mephibosheth indicate that he's not focused on what's lost, but what he has. And he sees himself as having no right to cry. We look at Mephibosheth and we see someone pitiable. That poor man, that poor boy. Mephibosheth looked at himself and he saw someone blessed. What a mindset. How do we view ourselves? Do we see each negative in life, each obstacle, each hardship, each aspect of loss as reason to lower self and become more focused on self? Or do we have a perspective that's more reflective of the man whose name means dispeller of shame? There's nothing more shameful than shamelessness. And shamelessness is always a result of selfishness. So in using his name as an idea and his life as a model, let's consider what it takes to scatter the shame of selfishness. First, to scatter the shame of selfishness, accept that the future is not fixed. That's a hard fact to face. It's a hard truth to learn at any age. He learned it at age 5. Think about all that seemed to be right in front of him that was taken that day. Mephibosheth had to learn that there's no guarantee of family structure. 5 years old and now he's an orphan. Daddy's gone and he had a good daddy. Now his grandfather had some problems, but he had a good daddy. But now dad is no more. Oh, who could Mephibosheth have been? What could he have learned? What kind of archer could he have been? By learning from his father, Jonathan, that great archer. No. His grandfather is no more. His father is no more. His family structure is broken. He'll spend his life growing up in the home of Machir, Transjordan in the east, in something of as something of a refugee. Mephibosheth. He was in line to the throne. The son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, of royal blood, so to speak. But he loses family structure. This is a hard truth ever to discuss. But family structure is not guaranteed. Death, divorce, and various other unforeseen circumstances can result in the home that once had this particular dynamic to be completely different. Feelings of abandonment, feeling alone, confusion, desperation. I think Mephibosheth felt those. He could relate. Can we? There's no guarantee of family structure. That might be all the more reason to express gratitude and love to the family we have while we have them. There's no guarantee of physical strength. His father was quite the impressive man. Yes, Jonathan had God's help when he and his armor bearer slew those 20 Philistines in a small area of land, but nonetheless, the fact remains, Jonathan was a model. He was a fighter, he was a friend, he was a father, but now he's out of the picture. Wonder, what sort of physical ability would Mephibosheth had inherited from his father just in terms of genetics? Remember, his grandfather stood head and shoulders above the rest. And now here's Mephibosheth, having been seemingly dropped by the maid, or for whatever reason he fell as the nurse was fleeing with him. He's now crippled, debilitated. Don't be too angry at the nurse. Have you ever tried to pick up a 5-year-old and run really fast? She was doing the best she could. And throughout the rest of his life, he would have to do the best he could. But his abilities have been hindered. Physical strength is not guaranteed. Sometimes it's the result of some sort of trauma. Sometimes it's not necessarily a physical debilitation. Throughout life, we may face emotional debilitation, psychological debilitation. There are times that we will face various circumstances and situations that will result in hindrances upon us. What will our outlook be? We know what Mephibosheth's was. There's no guarantee of family structure, there's no guarantee of physical strength, and there's no guarantee of social status. He was once in line for the throne, but in the Oriental mindset, one that was hindered or handicapped physically, one that was not able to be a model of strength, was not suitable to serve as king. A king could not lead his army into battle if he were disabled. He lost his father. He lost his mobility. And he lost the line to the throne all in one day. Now for many, that would be a day that would live in infamy in their minds, and it would define them permanently, not only in terms of their life circumstances, but their life outlook. Here's Mephibosheth. In some aspect, each of us can relate on some level to some trauma incurred, some abandonment or abuse experience, some mistreatment faced, some accident that seemed to take away what we took for granted. But there comes a point that another hard fact must be faced. There are times when we count as loss that which was never ours. There are times which we count as loss that which we assumed to be ours, but we had taken for granted tomorrow. We had taken for granted today. With Mephibosheth, from the very first introduction, there is a stark reminder that there's no guarantee of family structure. There's no guarantee of physical strength. There's no guarantee of social status. And all of these were no longer available for Mephibosheth, not because of any wrongdoing on the part of him or even his father. Yet, such is life, which moves forward to scatter and shatter the selfishness, it has to be accepted that the future isn't fixed. And thus we can't take for granted that I possess what's not mine. But it's also imperative that we admit that grace isn't entitled. What do we mean by that? 2 Samuel 9. David has assumed the throne. He's been reigning for a period of years. And he asks the question, are there any remaining of the house of Saul that I might show kindness? Pause. The word translated kindness is the Hebrew word chesed. In various translations of the Old Testament, it might be translated as mercy. It might be translated as goodness. It might be translated as steadfast love, as tender mercy, as loving kindness. David wants to show goodness, mercy, steadfast love, loving kindness, tender mercies to whomever remains of the house of Saul. And so he petitions a servant of Saul's house, Ziba. Are there any remaining of your master's house? Ziba names Mephibosheth. He tells David where Mephibosheth is located. Mephibosheth is brought to David. Now keep in mind, for many people, having had this much difficulty in life, Mephibosheth could have been a pessimist. He could have been of the mindset that, oh boy, I'm being brought to the now ruling king and I'm the only one left in my father's house. I'm a dead man. Because that was a common practice in that day, to remove all lineage of the previous king so as to suppress any potential for uprising. Here's Mephibosheth. And as he arrives in the presence of David, he falls to his face. He gives reverence. David says, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth says, behold your servant. He identifies himself as a servant from the start. David has said, I want to show kindness, chesed, to the house of Saul. And then in verse 3, he had told Ziba, I want to show the kindness of God. That's chesed. It's not just the kindness of David. David is exhibiting the very attributes that he's learned to be characteristic of his God. He wants to bestow those upon whomever remains of Saul's house. Here's Mephibosheth. And so he tells Mephibosheth, picking up at about verse 6, Mephibosheth, fear not, for I will surely show kindness. There's that chesed again. I'm going to show mercy, goodness, steadfast love, loving kindness, tender mercies for Jonathan your father's sake. Mephibosheth, you've not earned this. It's not because of anything you've done. It's not because of any stand you've taken. It's not because of who you are or even what you've suffered. It's because of who your father was. I'm going to show kindness. Mephibosheth has not earned this. He's not entitled to this, yet it's being offered to him. Generosity. It's incumbent upon us to recognize that kindness motivates generosity. When generosity is extended, it's not because I've earned it. When kindness is demonstrated, it's not because, well, I had it coming to me. This is not some sort of consolation prize or compensation to Mephibosheth because of the injury that he incurred so many years before. This is an act of kindness given only for the fact that David wants to keep his promise to Jonathan, to care for Jonathan's family, and indeed he does. Notice Mephibosheth's response. Well, it's about time. No. Oh, good. I've needed this. No. David tells Mephibosheth, I will restore unto thee all the land of thy father Saul, and you will eat at my table. Mephibosheth's response to David, what is thy servant that thou shouldest look upon a dead dog such as I? Who am I? Why are you being so good to me? There's a mindset in our entitlement minded world today that every time something good happens, well, I've earned it, I brought it to myself, I deserve it, give it to me. Not Mephibosheth. With Mephibosheth, it's a mindset of, as difficult as life has been, as much as was once before him that's no longer there, when a kindness is exhibited, when generosity is shown, who am I? Who am I that you should show such kindness? Now, in the years that ensue, Mephibosheth will eat at the king's table. In fact, David will treat Mephibosheth just like one of his sons, according to verses 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel 9. At the same time, he has told Ziba, that servant that identified Mephibosheth, you are going to take care of your master's lands. You are going to cultivate and care for them. Years pass. Rebellion occurs in David's house. Yes, David had made decisions that contributed to this, but we're going to stay focused on Mephibosheth. And in 2 Samuel 16, David is fleeing. He has to flee Jerusalem because of the uprising, the rebellion being led by his son Absalom. And as he is leaving, here comes Ziba with a large quantity of supplies. This is that servant of Mephibosheth, and he's coming to help David. What are these? These are for my lord the king, for those that are with him. Where's Mephibosheth? Ziba says that Mephibosheth has stayed in the city. That he has said that this day will Israel restore unto me the house of my father. According to Ziba, Mephibosheth, who is eating at David's table, is saying, I'll get to be king now. David tells Ziba, all thy Lord's lands are yours. And then David continues to flee. 2 Samuel 17 and 18 will record the battle that ensued. David's forces overcoming Absalom's. 2 Samuel 19, David is returning to Jerusalem. And 2 Samuel 19, beginning in verse 24, here comes Mephibosheth. And when Mephibosheth comes to David, notice his state, because his physical condition does not seem like one who's been celebrating and optimistic. 2 Samuel 19:24, Mephibosheth the son of Saul came down to meet the king. He had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed to the day he came again. Mephibosheth's been mourning because now he feels like he's lost something. The only exhibition of mourning Scripture records in the life of Mephibosheth was when David wasn't able to sit on his throne. That sounds like loyalty. That sounds like the very physical appearance of Mephibosheth exhibited his commitment to David and the dishonesty of Ziba. So here comes David. He's arrived in the city. Mephibosheth comes to meet him. Verse 25, it came to pass when he was come to Jerusalem to meet the king says, why didn't you go out with me, Mephibosheth? His reply, my servant lied to me. I had my servant go to saddle my ass, and my servant left me. Verse 26, I will saddle me an ass that I may ride thereon and go to the king. Your servant's lame. I couldn't do it myself. I sent a servant to do it, but he slandered me. Ziba lied to you. David's reply to Mephibosheth will be astounding. But Mephibosheth's words to David are even more so. He tells David, verse 27, my lord the king is as an angel of God. Do therefore what is good in thine eyes. My servant has slandered me, but you treat me the way you want to treat me. Because my father's house was like dead men before my lord the king, but you put me among those that eat at your table. Mephibosheth did not approach David with the mindset of what have you done for me lately. Mephibosheth approached David with a mindset of I remember what you've done for me. I remember that you were my king, that you brought me to sit at your table. I remember who you are and what you've done in the past, and you can take anything from me. Why? Honor, respect, gratitude. David's words are astounding because what he says to Mephibosheth is, why are you speaking any more to me of these matters? I've decided you and Ziba divide the land. David is traumatized. He's coming back from war with his own son. His decision-making process appears to be at least suspect at this moment. And yes, his pronouncement would indicate to us a certain level of unfairness. It's a difficult decision to process. We expect David to make all of this right. Whatever the circumstances. And perhaps there are aspects to it that we fail to see or understand. We know this much. Look at Mephibosheth's reply, verse 30. Mephibosheth said unto the king, he can have it all. Ziba can have all the land. The one that lied to me and tried to take my land, the one to whom you gave my land, he can have it all, because my lord the king has come again in peace to his own house. A final idea. Accept that the future isn't fixed. Admit that grace isn't entitlement, and adopt an attitude of gratitude. Because that's exactly what Mephibosheth exhibits. Even when he comes to David, beard disheveled, hair not cut, body in poor array, because he has been mourning the absence of David. The only reason he had to cry. And remember, he asks in verse 28 of 2 Samuel 19, what right have I therefore to cry? The only reason he had to cry was to cry for his king. The word translated cry carries the idea of a public shriek. He makes no public complaint. He's too humble to mumble, to groan and murmur against David. It's not about him. So often we ask in our lives, what about me? What about me? What about me? Mephibosheth is saying, what about my king? What about my king? King, my servant slandered me, but you're home. What about my king? He's too humble to mumble. And he's too grateful to gripe. He's simply thankful that his master and Lord has returned. And he's too cheerful to feel cheated. We read it and it seems unfair. We read it and we want to walk up to David and say, what are you thinking? Mephibosheth sees it. And just as we look at Mephibosheth and think he appears pitiable, he sees himself as blessed. We see this situation and it seems unfair. Mephibosheth doesn't care because his king is home. His king had flaws. Ours doesn't. How often is it the case that we become so focused on the material aspects of life, or even the physical relationships that we have in life, that we lose sight of our King? How often do we point our eyes to Calvary? How often do we turn our hearts to Gethsemane? How often when we are in the height of emotion and seemingly the lowest of moments, how often do we turn to behold Jesus and put things into perspective? How often in thinking about the fact that He's given us a place at His table? How often in thinking about the fact that He's reached out to us to bring us to Him? How often are we willing to tell ourselves, what right have I to cry? Oh, there's a time for tears. Solomon would declare at Ecclesiastes 3. Paul would encourage Christians to weep with them that weep, Romans 12:15. There's a time to cry. But with Mephibosheth, the crying that he had in mind was a certain self-pity. And he couldn't engage in that. Not when he was rejoicing over the return of his king. What right have I therefore to cry? The Apostle Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, would speak of this thorn in the flesh for which he petitioned the Lord to remove it. My grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12, beginning in verse 9 and following. Is His grace all we need? Is His grace sufficient? The future isn't fixed, but eternity can be for the faithful. Grace is not entitlement, but it's extended for those that will take advantage of it. And an attitude of gratitude, do we exhibit it? Do we live it? Does it define us? In a previous chapter in 2 Corinthians, Paul had reminded them of what Jesus had done on their behalf. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he were rich, yet he became poor, that ye through his poverty might become rich. Paul looked to Christ, identified his sacrifice, encouraging Christians to remember to exhibit generosity, yes, but ever to keep their eyes on him. Today, life's not easy. There are difficulties, there are disappointments, there are hardships, and there are heartbreaks. And there are times when our eyes will well with tears. And even in those moments, Mephibosheth's example is one that's worth revisiting. What right have I to cry? When we put life into its perspective, no, as difficult as the disappointments are, can we turn our eyes to him? Are your eyes turned to him now? Is your life turned to him now? Have you taken advantage of his offering to sit at his table? To gather around with his family, to be one of his? To take advantage of that is simple. It's as simple as heeding his words when he spoke of hearing his message, John 12:48. Believing, accepting his identity, John 8:24. Repenting of sins, Luke 24:46. Confessing him and being baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, Acts 2:38. Maybe it's the case that you're a child of God and you've allowed this life to overwhelm you. And it's time to ask that question, what right have I to cry? Maybe it's time to come to him for help. Maybe it's time to ask for prayers. Maybe it's time to repent. Whatever the case may be, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, why not take the opportunity while we stand and while we sing?